Tourism Minister Lindiwe Sisulu has written a column questioning the import of rule of law in South Africa, saying apartheid and Nazism were also underpinned by the rule of law. She goes on to deplore the sea of African poverty despite the existence of the constitution, which she describes and dismisses as palliative. Well, to unpack this further, we're joined by retired Judge President of the Competition Appeal Court and the High Court, Dennis Davis. Judge Davis, good evening to you and thank you for your time. A good place would be to start perhaps your initial impressions after having read that piece by the Tourism Minister Lindiwe Sisulu, somebody who's also been in government in senior positions as ministers across multiple portfolios for 21 years.
Yes, I wouldn't like to get into debate with the minister per se. I don't know what, when you read a column, you want to know, well, what's behind that and why is she writing this? What I thought was much more important was to address some of the contents of that. And it's terribly upsetting that one reads articles which suggest that the Constitution is some kind of neoliberal document, when quite obviously anybody who reads it would know that it's really a social democratic document which places the state at the center in relation to providing basic services and goods for all, and which has a substantive guarantee of equality for all. It's hardly a neoliberal document. We should be proud of it. It's the kind of document that if we actually implemented policies which vindicated its promises, we really wouldn't be in the position we are today. So I honestly find it extremely difficult. This is not the first article we've read like this. Maybe it's the first from a minister, but it really is very worrying that that is the kind of rhetoric that comes out at this particular point in time.
Of course, one of the considerations that we have to have when looking at our constitution and the extent to which it has been able to deliver at least some of the dividends of democracy to the majority of South Africans is that it is not a self-implementing document. The constitution can't make itself come alive.
The constitution can never make itself come alive. It depends on a number of things, and you're right. It depends, firstly, on the government's commitment and civil society. Let us be honest about it. If we look at the Zondo Commission report, we realize that to a large degree, the private sector is equally culpable for some of the disastrous positions we've been in over the past decade. But obviously, the government is vitally important in this regard. But then on the other hand, so is the judiciary. And that was really upset me, if I might say, is that I'm very proud to have served for 23 years on the bench. I look at my colleagues who today represent effectively the demography of the country, and they've done a magnificent job in asserting the rule of law, in vindicating the promises of the Constitution as best they can, and in a sense to have my black colleagues effectively classified as Uncle Toms or as people who've not really been decolonized is truly not just upsetting, it is extraordinarily insulting to incredibly dedicated, talented people committed to a progressive vision of the Constitution.
Of course, you're pointing there to part of just what is said in this article, that it's not just an attack on the Constitution in that it questions why there's still, quote, a sea of African poverty despite the existence of the Constitution, but it also calls into question the role of the rule of law. And if, in fact, African countries, and South Africa in particular, requires the rule of law to help it move forward.
Well, let's ask ourselves two questions on that proposition. The first is there a sea of African poverty? Absolutely. Do I want to live in a society like that? Absolutely not. It distresses me every day of my life that we live in a society with massive levels of poverty. Question is, why? Well, there are a whole range of reasons, but let's be quite frank about it. We have not had an economic policy which has effectively embraced inclusive growth. We've not had a policy that's delivered basic social goods and services to the population. We've just learned now, which is if we didn't know before because we did, just how much of taxpayers' money has essentially been gobbled up by rent seekers and all sorts of people who are implicated in that report. All of that money could have been used to reconstruct houses, better education, water, sewerage, all of that. So firstly, what the rule of law has got to do with that, I haven't the slightest idea. In fact, frankly, the rule of law is our best bet, as is the Constitution, because thanks to the rule of law, thanks to the Constitution, and might I say, thanks to the rights that we have, which were a basic product of struggle of hundreds of years in which people died for, we now have, as it were, a level of information about the levels of corruption, and we now can do something about it. Were we to live in an autocratic society, we'd have learned nothing about this, but the corruption would have continued apace. Let's be quite frank. If we have no rule of law, we don't have this Constitution, is there any rational person who's going to suggest that we are now going to live in a society which is going to bring about utopia? The answer is no. Oh, they will point to China and Singapore, but they're very different to us. And quite frankly, we want to live in a society where everybody has equal freedoms and dignity, but we also want to live in a society where people do not have to languish under poverty. And that's not because of the rule of law. That's because of an ineptitude of policies obviously for hundreds of years, but which includes what we've done as a nation. And we should look at ourselves and say, what is it that we now need to do? Let's stop moaning about canards, such as, well, it's the rule of law's fault, and ask ourselves, what 3 or 4 things are we going to do this year and then the next year to ensure that when we look at ourselves in 2023, 2024, etc., less people are languishing in poverty and more people are actually being able to enjoy the substantive fruits of citizenship, which every single South African deserves as of right.
Judge Davis, when we talk about the Constitution and what it promises to South Africans, a good place to start is, of course, the preamble. And I've heard you speak previously just on the power that is contained in this preamble. And just to quote very briefly, to heal the divisions of the past, establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. If even only that part were being effected to the full promise that is contained in the Constitution, would South Africa find itself with the type of social challenges that we're faced with today?
We can't heal our past when, in effect, what you look like depends on what you have. In other words, if, as in South Africa at present, and has been throughout the vicissitudes of South African history, class and race overlay, so that the vast majority of people are poor or black, and the vast majority of people suffered under apartheid and the history of apartheid, and today suffer under the similar circumstances in the past, there's no healing. And in fact, it was a wake-up call, it seemed, should have been a wake-up call to all of us in July last year when those uprisings took place. It was not to justify or exonerate anybody, but as to say, if we carry on like this, we'll have greater wounds rather than healing. Healing depends on ensuring that we recognize the dreadful, dreadful conditions under which people lived prior to 1994 and continue to live, and seek to say to them, we are doing things to ensure that actually those wounds are healed. And instead of what we've got is a whole bunch of rent capturing, which is eloquently documented in the Zondo report, rather than, in fact, what we should be doing is targeting all our efforts to ensuring that the poorest of the poor, and as we work our way through society, all of them actually have their fair share. And otherwise, the preamble of the Constitution, as magnificent as those words are not going to do anything. But that's not because of the word's fault. That's not because of the document's fault. That's because of our fault as a society.
And do you get a sense that there is that level of reflection and taking responsibility for the role that one plays or even has contributed to the current state of affairs? Because again, the article very much is written through the gaze of an outsider looking in. And for me, I think it's partially dishonest, because the very system that is being criticized is a system that one has been part of and has contributed to.
Yes, I think the answer to that question is a simple one. I think that if you look at the conditions in which we're in at present, I'd really be interested in asking perhaps to respond to your question the following: Why is it that you know, when you read an article like this, what do ordinary people think? What do people in the townships and the rural areas think? Do they really think, oh, well, if we got rid of the rule of law, all would be well? I'm sure they don't. And the trouble about it is we don't look at it from that point of view. And I am hopeful, I really am hopeful, that the Zondo report is an inflection point for all of us. The private sector needs to really come to the party and ask itself a whole series of questions as to how it was able to contribute and facilitate to the degradation of major institutions and to ensuring that money that should have gone to essentially do exactly what we've been talking about, uplift people, went into the pockets of greedy rent seekers. And on the same question, we have to ask ourselves is, how can we have a politics that ensures accountability to ordinary people rather than using them as voter fodder every 4 years? And quite frankly, if you read Zondo, even the first report, and I guess we're going to get even worse documentation as parts 2 and 3 come out, we have to ask ourselves further questions. How are we going to actually reconstitute the polity of South Africa so that it is responsive to the cries of ordinary people at the moment, who, if they were listening to this program, would be saying, well, where's my next meal coming from? Rather than some esoteric argument about whether, in fact, the Constitution has not quite captured a point or two. And by the way, may I say this, that the courts have ensured, particularly through the value of Ubuntu, a infusion of African values into the interpretation, which is to be welcomed and should be developed further.
Retired Judge Dennis Davis, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Pleasure.